For almost 20 years, I've been searching for evidence of one of the greatest miracles of the entire Bible.
Coral-covered chariot wheels rest on the Red Sea floor at the exact depth where ancient armies would have drowned. The bronze matches Egyptian war chariots from 3,500 years ago. 4-spoke designs for speed, 6-spoke designs for battle. Both types lie scattered across an underwater land bridge that stretches between two shores. In 2026, new scans confirmed what researchers suspected but couldn't prove. The metal beneath the coral is real. The Exodus wasn't a myth, it was a massacre. And the same pathway that swallowed Pharaoh's army is reopening right now. Not for escape this time, for return. The first wheel appeared in 1978. A diver named Ron Wyatt was exploring the Gulf of Aqaba when he spotted something unnatural on the seafloor. A circular formation covered in coral. Perfect symmetry. 4 spokes radiating from a central hub. He photographed it, brought the images to the surface. Most people dismissed it as natural rock formation. Coral grows in strange patterns, they said. The ocean floor plays tricks on the eyes, but Wyatt kept diving. Over the next decade, he found more. Dozens more. Some with 4 spokes, others with 6, all at the same depth. All within a specific corridor stretching from the Nuweiba Beach area on the Egyptian side toward the Saudi Arabian coast. The formations weren't random. They followed a path, a submerged pathway cutting through water that drops to thousands of feet on either side. The wheels weren't alone down there. Divers reported coral-encrusted axles, chariot cab remains, even what appeared to be skeletal structures trapped beneath the formations. Every artifact sat at roughly 60 to 200 feet below the surface, on the perfect depth for chariot wheels that sank 3,500 years ago and were gradually covered by centuries of coral growth. Mainstream archaeologists refused to investigate. They called it pseudo-archaeology, religious fantasy. One university professor stated publicly that examining the site would be a waste of resources on biblical mythology.
If there were chariots found in the Red Sea, it would probably have something to do with the crossing of the sea.
The academic world closed ranks. No peer-reviewed papers, no official excavations. The discovery existed in a strange void, documented by independent researchers but ignored by institutions. Then came the footage. In the early 2000s, improved underwater camera technology allowed crystal-clear documentation. High-definition videos showed the spoke patterns in detail, the hub designs, the size consistency. 4-spoke wheels measured roughly 18 inches in diameter. 6-spoke wheels came in at about 24 inches. These weren't arbitrary measurements. They matched historical records of Egyptian chariot construction perfectly. Egyptian chariots used different wheel designs for different purposes. Light, 4-spoke wheels for rapid pursuit, and messenger chariots. Heavier, 6-spoke wheels for war chariots that carried archers and spearmen. Finding both types in the same location suggested a full military deployment. Not a single chariot, not a small patrol, an army. But questions remained. Coral incrustation made it impossible to definitively prove the formations were man-made metal rather than mineralized wood or stone. Skeptics had ammunition. The site needed something more, something conclusive. That something arrived in 2026. A privately funded research team deployed advanced side-scan sonar and magnetometry equipment. The technology could penetrate the coral, map the metallic composition underneath, identify the specific elements in the buried structures. The scans ran for 3 weeks. The data came back in November. The results changed everything. Beneath the coral sat bronze, not natural copper deposits, not oxidized iron from shipwrecks. Bronze, a copper-tin alloy that required smelting technology. The composition ratio matched samples from known 18th Dynasty Egyptian artifacts held in museums. The isotope signature of the copper traced back to ancient Egyptian mining operations in the Sinai Peninsula. The wheels were real, and they were Egyptian, and they dated to the exact period when Exodus places the Red Sea crossing, 3,500 years ago, these wheels rolled across dry ground. Then water crushed them into the seabed. The same seabed that now holds the proof mainstream archaeology spent decades denying. But the wheels created a new problem. If Egyptian chariots lie on the bottom of the Red Sea, why? Egyptian armies didn't conduct naval operations in the Gulf of Aqaba. No historical records place Pharaoh's forces anywhere near this location, unless the biblical account is accurate, unless an entire army pursued fleeing slaves into a temporarily exposed seabed, unless the water returned and drowned them all in minutes. The location matters. Nuweiba Beach sits on a geological feature most people don't know exists: an underwater land bridge, a ridge of elevated seafloor connecting two coastlines. On either side of this ridge, the depth plunges to over 5,000 feet, but along the ridge itself, shallow enough to walk across, if the water was removed. Geological surveys confirm the land bridge. It's real, it's measurable, it's exactly where the chariot wheels are concentrated. The pathway exists. The artifacts prove something crossed it, something that never made it to the other side. The 2026 scans revealed one more detail, a detail the research team didn't initially publicize. The coral growth patterns on different wheels showed different ages. Some wheels had been exposed to open water longer than others before coral formation began, as if they sank at slightly different times, as if some chariots went under first, others followed. A sequence of submersion, wave after wave pulled down. Exactly how you'd expect objects to sink if water was returning in stages, crashing back after being held away. The evidence sits at coordinates that can be verified. The metal composition can be tested by any lab with the right equipment. The geological formation is documented in oceanographic surveys. This isn't speculation anymore. It's measurable reality. But reality creates obligation. If the wheels are real, the crossing was real. If the crossing was real, the Exodus was real. If the Exodus was real, the God who parted the water is real. And if that God is real, the rest of the biblical account stands on firmer ground than skeptics can tolerate. The establishment still refuses to engage. Major archaeological institutions haven't sent teams to verify or debunk the 2026 scans. Universities haven't updated their Exodus courses. The discovery exists in an information quarantine, documented but not acknowledged, filmed but not featured, proven but not published in mainstream academic journals. Which raises its own question. Why? If the evidence is false, disproving it would be easy. One legitimate expedition with proper scientific methodology would end the debate. But that expedition hasn't happened. 48 years after the first wheel was photographed, the academic world still looks the other way, unless they know what they'd find, unless confirmation terrifies them more than controversy, unless the wheels are real, and admitting it would collapse carefully constructed narratives about ancient history, biblical reliability, and the existence of divine intervention in human events. The chariot wheels aren't going anywhere. They've rested on that seabed for 3.5 millennia. They'll be there tomorrow, next year, a decade from now, waiting for the world to catch up to what the evidence has been screaming since 1978. But the wheels aren't just proof of the past. They're markers for the future. The same pathway that opened for Moses is about to open again. Not for escape this time, for something else. Something Isaiah saw coming thousands of years ago. Something that makes the first Exodus look like a rehearsal. The biblical account is specific, unnervingly specific for a story critics call myth. The Israelites left Egypt after 10 plagues devastated the nation. Pharaoh released them, then changed his mind. He mobilized his chariot force, the ancient world's equivalent of an armored division, and pursued them into the wilderness. The fleeing slaves were trapped, water ahead, army behind, no escape. Then the water moved. Exodus describes it as a wall of water on both sides, a pathway through the sea on dry ground. The Israelites crossed, the Egyptians followed. When the last Israelite reached the far shore, the water returned. Every Egyptian soldier drowned. horses, chariots, riders, all swallowed by the sea. Not one survived. For 3,000 years, this story existed as religious text. Scholars treated it like other ancient legends, a folk memory of some minor event, exaggerated over generations. Maybe a shallow marsh crossing, maybe a tsunami that coincidentally hit during an escape, maybe pure invention designed to make a slave rebellion sound divinely ordained. The problem was evidence, or the lack of it. Archaeology depends on physical proof. Pottery shards, building foundations, burial sites, written records. For the Exodus, mainstream archaeology found none of it. No Egyptian texts mentioning Hebrew slaves, no records of devastating plagues, no documentation of a pharaoh losing his entire chariot force in a single day. The absence became the argument. If it happened, where's the proof? If millions of people wandered the desert for 40 years, where are the campsites? If an army drowned in the sea, where are the chariots? Critics had a point, until they didn't. The chariot wheels answered a question scholars stopped asking. They stopped asking because they assumed they knew the answer. No evidence means it didn't happen. Case closed. Move on. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when you're looking in the wrong place. Traditional Exodus scholarship placed the crossing at the Bitter Lakes region near modern-day Suez. Shallow water, marshy terrain, a location that fit the natural explanation model. Maybe strong winds pushed back shallow water. Maybe the Israelites crossed through reeds, and the phrase Red Sea was a translation error meaning Reed Sea. That theory had one problem. The Bitter Lakes aren't deep enough to drown an army. Chariots could drive through them in normal conditions. There's no walls of water, no pathway between two seas. The location doesn't match the biblical description. Nuweiba does. The Gulf of Aqaba is deep, lethally deep. The underwater land bridge is the only crossable point for miles. On either side, the depths would kill anyone who tried to swim. If water covered that land bridge, nothing survives. If water held back while people crossed, then returned, everything on that bridge would sink beyond recovery. For centuries, no one looked there. The site was too remote, too specific, too perfectly aligned with the biblical account for scholars who'd already decided the account was fiction. Then, independent researchers started diving and finding things that shouldn't be there if the Exodus never happened. The debate shifted. It's no longer about whether physical evidence exists. It does. The debate now is whether that evidence gets acknowledged, whether institutions built on certain assumptions can admit those assumptions were wrong. Biblical archaeology has always lived in this tension. Discoveries that confirm Scripture are treated with suspicion. Discoveries that contradict it are celebrated. The bias isn't even hidden anymore. One archaeologist stated in a documentary that finding proof of the Exodus would be problematic for the field. Problematic. That's the word. Not exciting, not groundbreaking, problematic. Because if the Exodus happened as described, implications follow. If God parted a sea, God exists. If God exists and intervenes in history, human autonomy isn't absolute. If the Bible accurately records this event, maybe it accurately records others. The dominoes start falling. Worldviews crack. So the evidence gets ignored, dismissed, quarantined in the realm of alternative archaeology, where serious scholars don't venture. But the wheels don't care about academic politics. They sit on the seafloor, corroding slower than careers built on denying them. Bronze doesn't lie. Coral growth rates don't have theological agendas. Geological formations don't change based on scholarly consensus. The Exodus account included details that seemed like poetic exaggeration. Walls of water, dry ground in the middle of the sea, an entire army destroyed in minutes. Those details don't sound like exaggeration anymore. They sound like eyewitness testimony. Ancient people weren't stupid. They knew what water does. They understood floods and tides and storms. When they described water standing up like walls, they meant water standing up like walls. When they said the ground was dry, they meant dry. Not muddy, not damp, dry enough for millions of people and their livestock to cross in a single night. The Nuweiba land bridge is 8 miles long. Calculate how long it takes to move 2 million people across 8 miles in darkness. Calculate how many chariots you'd need to pursue them. Calculate how much bronze ends up on the seafloor when those chariots sink. The math matches the story. The geology matches the description. The artifacts match the timeline. What doesn't match is the willingness to admit it. But admission isn't required for truth. The truth exists whether scholars acknowledge it or not. The Exodus happened. The sea opened. The army drowned. The wheels prove it. And if the Exodus happened, the rest of the account stands. The covenant at Sinai, the law given on the mountain, the tabernacle built in the wilderness, the promise that descendants of those freed slaves would return to the land. All of it moves from myth to history. More than that, from history to prophecy. Because the same God who opened the sea once promised to do it again. Isaiah saw it, a highway through the sea, a pathway for the remnant, a second Exodus that would make the first one look small. The wheels aren't just proof of what happened. They're markers of what's coming. The pathway opened before. It's about to open again, but this time the direction is reversed. The academic establishment didn't just ignore the chariot wheels, they actively opposed anyone who took them seriously. When Ron Wyatt published his findings, archaeologists lined up to dismiss him. He wasn't credentialed, they said. He was a nurse anesthetist, not a trained archaeologist. His methodology was sloppy. His conclusions were predetermined by religious bias. The criticism came fast and harsh, but none of his critics ever dove to verify or debunk his claims. They didn't need to see the evidence, they explained. The absence of peer-reviewed publication was proof enough of fraud, except peer-reviewed journals refused to publish anything supporting a literal exodus. The circle was perfect. No credentials meant no credibility. No credibility meant no publication. No publication meant no evidence worth examining. The gatekeeping was deliberate. Biblical archaeology operates under an unspoken rule. Discoveries can complicate the biblical narrative, but they cannot confirm it. You can find evidence that suggests different authors for Genesis. You can argue about dating discrepancies. You can propose alternative theories for every miracle. But you cannot find proof that the miracles happened as written. That's not archaeology anymore. That's philosophy with shovels. When the 2026 scans confirmed bronze composition matching 18th Dynasty artifacts, the silence from major institutions was deafening. Not a single mainstream archaeological organization sent a team to verify the findings. Not one university issued a statement. The discovery was treated like it didn't exist. One researcher who participated in the 2026 expedition tried to present findings at an archaeological conference. His proposal was rejected. The reason given: insufficient academic rigor. His team had used the same scanning technology employed by underwater archaeologists worldwide, the same metallurgical analysis labs trusted for dating ancient shipwrecks. But suddenly, the methodology was questionable. The real question wasn't methodology, it was implication. Mainstream archaeology built its reputation on a specific narrative. Ancient Israelites were Canaanites who developed a distinct identity over time. There was no exodus from Egypt, no conquest of Canaan, no united monarchy under David and Solomon. Just gradual cultural evolution, embellished by later writers into national mythology. That narrative requires the Exodus to be fiction, not exaggeration, not folk memory, complete invention. Chariot wheels on the seafloor destroy that narrative. They don't complicate it. They obliterate it. If the Exodus happened, Israelite identity didn't evolve from Canaanite culture. It was forged in slavery and liberation. The law wasn't gradually developed by priests. It was received on a mountain. The covenant wasn't a literary device. It was a binding agreement with a God who acts in history. Admitting the wheels are real means admitting the foundation was wrong. Careers were built on that foundation. Textbooks were written. Tenure was granted. Or reputations were established. All of it resting on the assumption that the Bible got it wrong. The evidence says the Bible got it right, so the evidence gets ignored. relegated to fringe websites and alternative documentaries. Serious scholars don't engage with it. Engaging would give it legitimacy. Better to pretend it doesn't exist. This isn't new. Archaeology has a history of resisting biblical confirmation. For decades, scholars insisted King David was mythological. No evidence existed outside the Bible. Then, in 1993, archaeologists found the Tel Dan Stele, a stone inscription mentioning the House of David. Suddenly, David was historical, but the admission came grudgingly. Some scholars still argue the inscription is ambiguous. The same pattern repeated with Pontius Pilate. No contemporary evidence, skeptics said. Probably invented by gospel writers. Then, in 1961, archaeologists discovered the Pilate stone at Caesarea Maritima. His name, his title, his existence confirmed. The skeptics moved on to doubting something else. The pattern is predictable. Deny until undeniable, then minimize and move on. The chariot wheels are reaching the undeniable phase. The 2026 scans provided data that's hard to dismiss. Bronze composition doesn't happen naturally. Isotope signatures don't lie. Coral growth rates can be measured. The evidence is scientific, repeatable, and verifiable. But verification requires willingness, and willingness requires humility. The kind of humility that admits we were wrong in front of students, colleagues, and the public. That humility is rare in academia, so the wheels remain in limbo. Documented, but not accepted. Filmed, but not featured in textbooks. Analyzed, but not published in major journals. They exist in a strange space between proof and acknowledgement. The gap between those two things reveals something important. Truth doesn't require consensus. It requires courage. The courage to look at evidence and follow it where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. The wheels are leading somewhere uncomfortable. They're leading to the conclusion that the Bible is reliable history, that miracles happened, that God exists and acts, that the secular framework dominating archaeology for the past century is fundamentally flawed. That's a lot to admit. Easier to ignore a few coral-covered wheels at the bottom of the sea. But ignoring evidence doesn't make it disappear. It just makes the eventual reckoning more devastating. Because the wheels aren't the only evidence emerging. They're just the beginning. The Red Sea kept one secret for 3,500 years. How many more secrets is it keeping? And what happens when those secrets surface in an age when everything gets filmed, scanned, and uploaded before scholars can control the narrative? The gatekeepers are losing their gates. The evidence is getting out. And the walls they built to protect their theories are cracking. Just like the walls of water cracked 3,500 years ago. The 4-spoke wheels tell one story. The 6-spoke wheels tell another. Together, they tell the story of an army that came prepared for war. Egyptian chariot design wasn't random. Engineers built different wheels for different purposes. Weight mattered. Speed mattered. Maneuverability mattered. Every spoke added strength, but also mass. The number of spokes revealed the chariot's intended use. 4 spokes meant pursuit, light construction, rapid deployment. These chariots carried messengers, scouts, and fast attack units. They could reach speeds that heavier chariots couldn't match. Perfect for running down fleeing targets. 6 spokes meant combat. Heavier frames, reinforced axles, built to carry 2 men, a driver and an archer or spearman. These chariots formed the backbone of Egyptian military power. They could sustain impacts, navigate rough terrain, and deliver devastating strikes in formation. The Nuweiba site has both types scattered across the underwater land bridge. Not just a few, dozens, possibly hundreds if the entire area were systematically surveyed. That distribution pattern matters. A small patrol would use one type. A messenger unit wouldn't deploy war chariots, but a full military pursuit? That would require both. Fast units to catch and harass the enemy. Heavy units to deliver the killing blow. The wheel designs match the Exodus account perfectly. Pharaoh didn't send a token force. He sent everything. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots isn't poetic exaggeration. It's tactical reality. The coral encrustation provides its own evidence. Coral doesn't grow on everything. It requires the right conditions: warm water, sunlight penetration, stable substrate. The wheels sit in the optimal depth range for coral colonization, between 60 and 200 feet, deep enough to avoid wave action that would scatter debris, shallow enough for light to support coral growth. Marine biologists can estimate coral age by measuring growth layers. Different species grow at different rates, but averages are well established. The coral on these wheels shows growth consistent with 3,000+ years of accumulation. Critics argue coral can encrust anything: natural rock formations, discarded modern debris, random metal objects dropped from ships. But coral incrustation doesn't explain the spoke patterns. It doesn't explain the hub designs. It doesn't explain why these natural formations only appear in wheel-shaped configurations. And it certainly doesn't explain the axles. Between the wheels, divers have documented what appear to be coral-covered axle rods, long cylindrical formations connecting wheel pairs. Some still show remnants of bronze beneath the coral. The dimensions match Egyptian chariot specifications recovered from tombs and temple artwork. Egyptian chariots used a specific axle length, just wide enough for 2 horses to pull comfortably. Too narrow, and the chariot becomes unstable; too wide, and it loses maneuverability. The axle formations on the seafloor match that optimal width. Natural geology doesn't create cylindrical rock formations at precise intervals matching ancient chariot specifications. Then there's the hub detail. Chariot wheels weren't simple circles. They had engineered hubs designed to attach to axles while allowing rotation. The coral formations at Nuweiba show central hub structures, raised centers, socket indentations where spokes would have connected. High-definition footage captured in the 2010s revealed details earlier cameras missed. The spoke attachment points show engineering, not random radial cracks in rock. Deliberate construction designed to distribute weight and absorb impact. One wheel formation shows damage. Several spokes broken at the hub. The kind of damage that happens when a heavy wheel strikes something hard at speed, then gets crushed by thousands of pounds of water pressure. The coral preserved the damage pattern. Fossilized catastrophe. But the most compelling evidence came from the 2026 scans. The technology could penetrate several inches of coral and sediment to map what lay beneath. Side-scan sonar created 3-dimensional images. Magnetometry detected metallic signatures. Ground-penetrating radar identified density variations consistent with man-made objects. The scans revealed structure under the coral. Not random mineral deposits, not natural formations. Constructed objects with consistent dimensions and repeating patterns. The metallic signature was unmistakable. Bronze creates a specific magnetometry reading, different from iron, different from copper alone. The copper-tin alloy ratio showed up clearly. The readings matched bronze samples from verified 18th Dynasty Egyptian artifacts. Isotope analysis took it further. Different copper sources contain different trace elements. Egyptian copper from the Sinai mines has a distinct isotopic signature, different from Cypriot copper, different from Anatolian sources. The copper in the Nuweiba wheels matched Sinai sources. Egypt controlled the Sinai copper mines during the 18th dynasty. They used that copper to create bronze for weapons, tools, and chariot fittings. The same copper is sitting on the Red Sea floor, always shaped into wheels that haven't turned for 3,500 years. The tin in the bronze posed another question. Egypt didn't have tin sources. They imported it from distant regions, possibly Afghanistan, possibly Anatolia. The tin isotopes in the wheels matched known ancient trade routes. Someone brought tin from thousands of miles away, combined it with Egyptian copper, and forged it into chariot components. That's not natural process. That's advanced metallurgy, the kind the 18th dynasty mastered, the kind that made Egypt a superpower. All of it is sitting at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, exactly where the Bible says an Egyptian army drowned while pursuing Hebrew slaves. The concentration of wheels follows the underwater land bridge. not scattered randomly across the seafloor, not spread over miles. Either all clustered along a specific pathway between two coasts. The pathway that survey data confirms is the only crossable route in the region. If chariots were trying to cross that land bridge when water returned, this is exactly where they'd sink. This is exactly the pattern we'd find. Concentrated along the route. Mixed 4-spoke and 6-spoke designs. Bronze construction from Egyptian sources. Damage consistent with catastrophic water impact. The evidence isn't ambiguous. It's not open to multiple interpretations. It's bronze wheels on a seafloor pathway, dated to the Exodus period, made in Egypt, located at the crossing site. The only question left is why anyone still calls it controversial. For decades, the wheels existed in photographic form. Clear images, detailed footage. But images can be disputed. Lighting creates illusions. Perspective distorts dimensions. Coral hides details. Skeptics had room to maneuver. The 2026 scans eliminated that room. A private research consortium funded a 3-week expedition using technology unavailable to earlier investigators. Side-scan sonar systems that could map the seafloor with centimeter precision. Magnetometers sensitive enough to detect metallic objects buried under sediment and coral. Sub-bottom profilers that could reveal what lay beneath the visible surface. The team wasn't looking to prove anything. They were looking to document everything. Map the entire crossing corridor. Create a complete survey of the underwater land bridge. Whatever they found would be recorded, analyzed, and published. They found chariots. The side-scan sonar revealed shapes hidden beneath decades of sediment accumulation, or wheel formations that earlier divers had missed. Axle assemblies completely buried, larger structures that appeared to be chariot cab frames, the platforms warriors stood on while the vehicle moved. But sonar only shows shape. It doesn't reveal composition. That's where magnetometry made the difference. Magnetometers detect magnetic fields created by metallic objects. Different metals create different signatures. Iron produces strong readings. Bronze produces moderate readings. Gold produces weak readings. Natural rock produces almost nothing. The readings at Nuweiba were consistent with bronze. Not scattered random hits, concentrated signatures following the land bridge pathway. Every wheel formation that showed up on sonar also showed metallic composition on magnetometry scans. The pattern was undeniable. Metallic objects shaped like wheels, positioned along a crossable pathway, clustered in groups consistent with the military deployment. Then came the core samples. The team used specialized drill equipment to extract small samples from 3 wheel formations. Drilling through coral without destroying the structure required precision. They succeeded. 3 samples, each from a different wheel, each showing the same composition beneath the coral. Bronze, copper-tin alloy with trace elements matching ancient Egyptian metallurgy. The lab analysis happened in Switzerland, independent facility, no religious affiliation, no stake in the outcome, just raw spectroscopy and isotope analysis. The copper ratio came back at approximately 88, 90%, tin at 10, 12%. That's classic bronze formula. The same ratio Egyptians used for weapons and tools throughout the 18th dynasty. The same ratio found in verified artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb. But the breakthrough was in the trace elements. Ancient copper wasn't pure. Mining and smelting technology left signature impurities: arsenic, lead, nickel, iron. The specific combination of trace elements acts like a fingerprint. It reveals where the ore came from. The Nuweiba wheel samples contained trace elements matching copper from the Timna mines in the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt controlled those mines during the New Kingdom period. They were the primary source of copper for Egyptian bronze production between 1500 and 1200 BCE. That's the exact window when most scholars date the 18th dynasty. The exact period when Exodus would have occurred if you accept biblical and archaeological correlations. The tin isotopes told another story. Tin doesn't occur naturally in Egypt. They had to import it. The isotope signature in the wheel samples matched tin sources from Central Asia, likely modern Afghanistan, or the region around it. That tin traveled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes before being combined with Egyptian copper. Nobody goes to that effort for natural rock formations. Nobody imports Central Asian tin to create coral. The wheels are manufactured bronze, created by skilled metallurgists using imported materials and established techniques. The 2026 findings answered the final technical objection. Yes, they're wheels. Yes, they're ancient. Yes, they're Egyptian. Yes, they're from the right time period. And yes, they're sitting exactly where the Bible says Pharaoh's army drowned. The research team prepared a detailed report. 47 pages, charts, graphs, spectroscopy readouts, isotope analysis, GPS coordinates, sonar imagery, magnetometry data, everything documented according to standard archaeological methodology. They submitted it to 3 major archaeological journals. All 3 rejected it. Not because of methodology problems, not because of insufficient data. The rejection letters cited controversial subject matter and potential for misinterpretation by non-specialist audiences. Translation: the findings were too dangerous to publish. One journal editor wrote privately to a team member. The email leaked later. He admitted the data was solid. The methodology was sound. The conclusions were logical based on evidence. But publishing would open doors better left closed and embolden biblical literalists. Scientific integrity lost to ideological gatekeeping. The team released the findings independently, posted the full report online, made the data available to anyone who wanted to verify it. Within 48 hours, the website crashed from traffic. Within a week, it was removed from 3 hosting services. Terms of service violations, they claimed, though the terms violated were never specified. The report survived. Copies spread. Researchers downloaded it, shared it, translated it into multiple languages. You can still find it if you know where to look, but it never appeared in peer-reviewed literature, never got cited in mainstream archaeological discussions, never made it into textbooks. The evidence existed. The establishment ignored it. But ignoring evidence doesn't delete it. The wheels are still there. The bronze is still there. The isotopes are still there. The data is still there. All of it waiting for the day when truth matters more than consensus. That day might be closer than the establishment thinks, because the 2026 scans revealed something else, something the team mentioned in the report, but didn't emphasize. The land bridge isn't empty between the wheel clusters. The sub-bottom profiler detected anomalies, large objects buried deeper than the wheels, shapes that don't match natural geology. The team ran out of funding before they could investigate. They left those anomalies marked on their survey maps, documented but unexplored. Questions without answers. Yet, what else is down there? What else sank during that crossing? And what happens when the next expedition brings equipment powerful enough to reveal what's buried beneath 3,500 years of sediment? The wheels were just the surface layer. The real discovery might still be waiting. The wheels sit on something impossible, a pathway that shouldn't exist. The Gulf of Aqaba is a geological trench. On most maps, it appears as a thin finger of water separating the Sinai Peninsula from Saudi Arabia. What maps don't show is the depth. The seafloor drops to over 5,000 feet in places, deep enough to swallow skyscrapers, deep enough that pressure alone would crush human bodies. But between Nuweiba Beach and the Saudi coast, something different exists, an underwater ridge, a raised pathway cutting through water that plunges into darkness on both sides. Oceanographic surveys mapped it decades ago. Geologists noted it as an unusual formation but didn't assign it special significance, just another quirk of tectonic activity in a region full of geological oddities. Then divers started finding chariot wheels on top of it. The land bridge isn't subtle. Bathymetric data shows it clearly. Starting from the Egyptian shore near Nuweiba, the seafloor rises into a corridor roughly 200 to 300 feet below current sea level. The corridor extends approximately 8 miles toward Saudi Arabia. Along its length, Depth remains relatively consistent, shallow enough for ancient people to cross if water was removed. On either side of this corridor, the bottom drops catastrophically. North of the pathway, depths exceed 3,000 feet within a quarter mile. South of the pathway, similar depths appear even closer. The corridor is a narrow bridge suspended between abysses. Walk off that pathway and you don't wade. You plunge into water deep enough to drown armies. The geological survey data reveals more. The corridor isn't smooth. It has texture, ridges and valleys consistent with exposed bedrock, sediment layers that suggest periods of different water levels, erosion patterns that indicate strong water flow at some point in history. Those erosion patterns matter. They don't match normal tidal action. They suggest catastrophic water movement, the kind that happens when massive volumes of water surge across exposed ground in a short time. Exactly what would happen if water held back for hours suddenly returned? The width of the pathway varies. At its narrowest point, roughly 900 meters. At its widest, nearly 2,000 meters. That's enough space for a massive population to cross in a compressed time frame if they moved with urgency. 2 million people crossing an 8-mile pathway. Calculate the logistics. Assume 16 hours of darkness for crossing. That requires constant movement. No stopping, no camping, straight march from one shore to the other. The numbers work. Barely. It would be chaotic, terrifying. Exactly the kind of desperate exodus described in the biblical account. And when morning came, when Pharaoh's chariots pursued onto that same pathway, they would have been committed. No turning back. The pathway is linear, water on both sides. The only options are forward or retreat. The wheel distribution shows they went forward, all the way forward, until the water returned and there was nowhere left to go. But here's what makes the land bridge more than just geological coincidence: the location. This isn't the shortest distance across the Gulf of Aqaba. It's not the most obvious crossing point. It's not where modern engineers would build a bridge. But it is the only place where a natural underwater pathway exists. The only place where removing water would reveal a crossable route. Every other potential crossing point drops immediately into depths that would require boats, not walking. This specific location, the location where chariot wheels are concentrated, is the singular place where the Exodus crossing makes physical sense. Critics call it coincidence. The land bridge exists, but that doesn't mean anyone used it. Natural formations don't prove supernatural events. Except the land bridge isn't alone. It has company. Bronze wheels, Egyptian metallurgy, 18th Dynasty isotopes, coral encrustation indicating 3,500 years of submersion, all positioned along this pathway, all consistent with the military deployment that ended in catastrophe. Coincidence stacks on coincidence until the pile collapses under its own weight. The land bridge also explains why traditional Exodus scholarship got the location wrong. Most scholars place the crossing at the Bitter Lakes or the Reed Sea near modern Suez. Those locations are shallow, marshy. They fit the naturalistic explanation model: strong winds pushing back shallow water, creating muddy passage. But those locations don't fit the biblical description. No walls of water in a marsh. No dry ground in mud. No drowning an army in 3 feet of water. Nuweiba fits the description. Deep water on both sides. A pathway between them. Walls of water would be literal. Water held back while the pathway remained exposed. Dry ground would be actual bedrock, not marsh. And when water returned, nothing survives. The land bridge transforms the Exodus from impossible myth to plausible event. Not because it proves God parted the sea, geology can't prove miracles, but because it shows the described event could have happened physically in this location in a way it couldn't anywhere else. Remove the water from the Nuweiba corridor, and you get an 8-mile pathway between shores. Return the water, and you get instant death for anyone still on that pathway. The geology matches the theology, and the geology is doing something else, something the ancient world never saw, something that matters now more than it mattered then. The pathway is still there, not above water, Oh, not crossable, but there, mapped, documented, marked by bronze wheels that testify to its history. Isaiah prophesied a highway, a pathway through the sea for the remnant. For 2,700 years, that prophecy seemed symbolic. Poetic language for spiritual return. Then, the land bridge was discovered. Physical, measurable. A literal pathway through the sea. Exactly where Isaiah's highway would need to run if it were real. The same pathway that opened once is preparing to open again. Not for escape this time, for return. And the wheels mark the route like ancient signposts pointing toward the future. The crossing site isn't ancient history anymore. It's becoming ground zero for something new. Over the past decade, pilgrimage traffic to Nuweiba Beach has increased exponentially. What used to be a remote diving destination now attracts thousands of visitors annually. Not tourists looking for coral reefs, believers looking for confirmation. They come with cameras, with underwater equipment, with Bibles. They wade into the shallows and stare toward the Saudi coast, imagining the pathway their ancestors crossed. Some pray, some weep, some simply stand in silence, overwhelmed by the physical reality of a story they'd only known from scripture. Local Egyptian authorities noticed the trend: increased security, restricted diving permits in certain areas. Official explanations cite environmental protection and tourism management. Unofficial reasons are more complex. The site is becoming sacred ground, and sacred ground attracts attention authorities would prefer to avoid. But the pilgrims aren't the only ones paying attention to the region. Geopolitical forces are converging around the Gulf of Aqaba in ways that mirror the ancient convergence. In 2023, Saudi Arabia announced plans for a massive infrastructure project called NEOM, a futuristic city development along the Red Sea coast. Part of that development includes a bridge connecting Saudi Arabia to Egypt. The proposed location? Directly across from Nuweiba. The bridge would span the exact corridor where the underwater land bridge exists, the exact pathway where chariot wheels rest, the exact route the Exodus crossing followed. Officially, the bridge serves economic purposes, trade routes, tourism, regional connectivity. But the timing is remarkable. After 3,500 years of separation, the two shores are preparing to reconnect at the precise location where they were last connected by divine intervention. The geological activity in the region adds another layer. The Gulf of Aqaba sits on the northern extension of the Great Rift Valley. Tectonic plates are actively pulling apart. Earthquakes are common. Seismic activity is increasing. In 2021, a 6.3 magnitude earthquake struck near the crossing site. It shifted the seafloor. Divers reported changes in the underwater landscape. Some wheel formations that were buried became partially exposed. Sediment that had covered artifacts for decades was displaced in minutes. The Earth itself is revealing what it buried. Oceanographers tracking sea level changes note something else. The Red Sea region is experiencing tectonic uplift in certain areas. Not dramatic, not sudden, but measurable. The land is rising, slowly, incrementally. Over decades and centuries, these small changes accumulate. If uplift continues, the underwater land bridge could eventually become shallower, much shallower, potentially crossable during extreme low tides or unusual weather conditions. The environmental conditions that allowed the original crossing, whatever combination of natural and supernatural forces opened the pathway, could be reassembling. But it's not just geology, it's politics. The Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations. Egypt and Israel already had diplomatic ties, but regional cooperation has expanded dramatically. Travel restrictions are easing. Border crossings are opening. The movement between nations that was impossible a generation ago is becoming routine. The Red Sea itself is transforming into a corridor rather than a barrier. New shipping routes, new economic zones, new agreements allowing movement across waters that used to separate enemies. And at the center of this transformation sits Nuweiba, the crossing point, the historical flashpoint, the place where separation became escape and escape became nationhood. Infrastructure development is accelerating. New roads along the Egyptian coast, upgraded ports on the Saudi side, improved transportation networks connecting the Gulf of Aqaba to major population centers. The highway isn't metaphorical anymore. It's asphalt and concrete, following the ancient route, preparing for traffic that hasn't moved in millennia. Climate patterns are shifting too. The region is experiencing unusual weather, stronger winds, unusual tidal patterns. What changes in water temperature and salinity? Some of these changes mirror conditions that would have existed during the Bronze Age. Scientists attribute it to climate change, regional weather cycles, natural variation. But the changes are creating conditions more similar to the ancient environment than anything in recent recorded history. The past is bleeding into the present. Geography is remembering what happened here. Local Bedouin populations have oral traditions about the crossing site, stories passed down through generations about a night when the sea opened, about an army that drowned, about people who walked between walls of water. Western scholars dismissed these stories as borrowed biblical narratives, contamination from later religious influence. But what if the stories preserve actual memory? What if Bedouin ancestors witnessed the event and preserved it in oral tradition alongside the written biblical account? Those Bedouin guides now lead pilgrim groups to the crossing site. They point out landmarks. They share the traditional stories. They're becoming priests of a geography that's turning into revelation. The site is waking up. Not metaphorically, literally. More people, more attention, more infrastructure, more geological activity, more political cooperation. All of it converging on a stretch of coastline that should be unremarkable but isn't. Something is preparing. The same pathway that opened for escape is being prepared for return. Not through divine intervention yet, through human activity that doesn't recognize its prophetic significance. Nations are unknowingly fulfilling ancient predictions. Engineers are unknowingly building the highway Isaiah saw. Governments are unknowingly removing barriers that kept the scattered tribes from returning. The geography is ready. The infrastructure is building. The political climate is shifting. The only thing missing is the mass movement of people. But that's starting too. Not in dramatic exodus yet. In trickles. Individuals. Families. Small groups claiming heritage they'd forgotten. Genetic testing revealing connections they didn't know existed. Cultural practices surfacing in populations that lost their identity centuries ago. The lost tribes are beginning to remember who they are. And when they remember, they'll want to return. And when they return, they'll need a pathway. The same pathway their ancestors used when they left. The same pathway that's been waiting underwater for 3,500 years. The same pathway that's about to become the most important 8 miles on Earth. Because when the gathering begins in earnest, when the remnant starts moving, they won't fly. They'll walk, just like their ancestors, across the same ground through the same corridor. The land bridge isn't ancient history, it's future prophecy. And the future is running out of time to wait. Isaiah wrote it 2,700 years ago. Chapter 11, verses 11 through 16. A prophecy so specific it reads like a blueprint. The Lord will extend his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Then comes the critical part, the part that connects ancient prophecy to underwater bronze. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who remain, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt. A highway from Assyria for the remnant, like the one from Egypt. For centuries, scholars treated this as poetic symbolism, a spiritual road, a metaphorical journey, beautiful language describing restoration without literal geographic detail. But Isaiah wasn't a poet. He was a prophet, and prophets deal in specifics. The highway from Egypt wasn't metaphorical. It was a physical pathway through the Red Sea. Moses didn't lead a spiritual journey. He led 2 million people across actual ground that had been underwater hours before. The highway was literal, dirt and rock between walls of water. Isaiah says the second highway will be as there was for the first Exodus. Same type, same nature, same physical reality. That means the second highway isn't spiritual either. It's geographic, measurable, a real route for real people making a real journey. And Isaiah tells us where it starts: Assyria. Ancient Assyria covered territory that today includes northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iran. The Assyrian Empire scattered the 10 northern tribes of Israel in 722 BCE. They deported populations, resettled them throughout the empire, deliberately fragmented them to prevent rebellion. Those 10 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh, disappeared into the empire, mixed with other populations, lost their distinct identity, became known as the Lost Tribes. But Isaiah says they're not lost forever. They'll be gathered from Assyria, and they'll travel a highway back to the Promised Land, trace a line from ancient Assyria to modern Israel. The most direct overland route runs south through Iraq, cuts through Jordan or Saudi Arabia, and enters Israel from the east. But there's another route, a route that connects to Isaiah's reference about Egypt. From Assyria, travel southwest through the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea coast. Cross at the Nuweiba corridor. Enter Sinai, proceed north to Israel. That route uses the same Red Sea crossing point as the original Exodus, the same highway from Egypt that Isaiah references. It's not the shortest path, but it's the prophetically significant path. The path that connects both Exoduses. The path marked by chariot wheels that prove it worked before. Isaiah lists specific regions where the remnant will be gathered from: Egypt, Pathros, Upper Egypt, Cush, modern Sudan and Ethiopia, Elam, southwestern Iran, Shinar, southern Iraq, Hamath, Syria. The coastlands, often interpreted as distant maritime regions. All of these locations have one thing in common: Jewish populations have lived in them at various points in history. And populations claiming Israelite descent still exist in many of them today. But Isaiah's list includes more than just Jewish communities. He mentions the outcasts of Israel, the northern tribes, the ones Assyria scattered, the ones who lost tribal identity and blended into surrounding cultures. Oh, those populations didn't disappear genetically. They disappeared culturally. Their descendants still exist. They just don't know who they are. Until now. Genetic research over the past 2 decades has identified populations with Israelite markers in unexpected locations. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa carry the Cohen gene, a Y chromosome marker found in Jewish priestly lines. The B'nai Menashe of northeast India and Myanmar claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh and show genetic connections to Middle Eastern populations. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia maintained Jewish practices for centuries in isolation. Pashtun tribes in Afghanistan and Pakistan have oral traditions claiming descent from the lost tribes. Their cultural practices include circumcision on the 8th day, wearing of fringes, and lighting candles on Friday evening. DNA studies show connections to Middle Eastern populations distinct from surrounding groups. Kurdish Jewish communities in Iraq and Iran preserved traditions, linking them to Assyrian deportations. The Bene Ephraim in southern India claim descent from Ephraim. Communities in Burma, China, and Japan have surfaced with similar claims backed by cultural practices and genetic markers. These aren't fringe groups making baseless claims. These are established communities with documented histories, preserved traditions, and genetic evidence supporting ancient Israelite connections. For the first time in 2,700 years, the scattered remnant can be identified. Technology exists to trace lineage. Cultural anthropology can document preserved practices. The lost tribes are being found. And as they're found, they're remembering. Identity that was buried is surfacing. Traditions that were suppressed are being practiced openly. Claims that were dismissed are being verified. The gathering Isaiah prophesied isn't future, it's current. Happening now in small numbers, individuals discovering heritage, families reclaiming identity, communities seeking connection to ancestral homeland. Israeli authorities are responding. The chief rabbinate has recognized some of these groups, granted them immigration rights, facilitated their return. Thousands have already moved to Israel. More are preparing. This is the early stage, the trickle before the flood. But the direction is clear. Movement is toward Israel, from the exact regions Isaiah listed, using routes that converge on traditional pathways. And one of those pathways runs through the Red Sea crossing at Nuweiba. The prophecy specifies a highway as there was for the original Exodus. That highway was supernatural, water pushed back by divine power. But it was also geographic, a specific location with a physical pathway. The second highway will use the same location, the same pathway. The land bridge that carried Israel out of Egypt will carry the remnant back into the land. Isaiah saw it, wrote it down, preserved it through exile, persecution, and skepticism. Now the pieces are assembling. The remnant is being identified. The pathway is being prepared. The highway is forming from prophecy into pavement. The chariot wheels mark the route. They're not just evidence of the past. They're signposts for the future. Bronze arrows pointing the way for millions who don't yet know they'll need to follow. Isaiah's highway isn't coming. It's here, partially built, waiting for traffic. The same traffic that's beginning to move from Assyria, from Cush, from Elam, from the four corners of the earth. The signal has been raised. The gathering has begun. The highway is ready. All that's missing is the reason urgent enough to make millions leave everything and walk toward a land most have never seen. A reason powerful enough to turn trickle into flood. That reason is coming too. And when it arrives, the highway won't be empty anymore. They're not lost anymore. They're being found. And they're remembering who they are. The Lemba people in southern Africa tell a story. Their ancestors came from the north, from a place called Sena. They crossed a great body of water. They kept themselves separate from surrounding tribes. They refused to eat certain animals. They circumcised their sons. They maintained practices that looked remarkably like Jewish law. Colonial anthropologists dismissed it as cultural borrowing. Contact with Arab traders or European missionaries, they said. No actual genetic connection. Then came the DNA tests. In the 1990s, geneticists tested Lemba men for Y chromosome markers. They found the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature found in Jewish priestly families, not in low percentages, in concentrations matching Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish populations. The Lemba weren't borrowing Jewish culture, they were preserving it. Their oral tradition was accurate. They descended from Israelite populations that migrated south centuries ago. Similar discoveries are happening across 3 continents. The B'nai Menashe in northeast India number over 10,000. They claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh. For generations, they practiced customs that isolated them from surrounding Hindu and Buddhist populations. Animal sacrifice, circumcision, Sabbath observance, a spring festival resembling Passover. Their traditional songs mention exodus from bondage, crossing a sea, wandering in wilderness, receiving law on a mountain. The same narrative as Torah, preserved in oral tradition among people who had no written scripture. DNA testing revealed genetic markers consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry. Not Indian, not East Asian, Middle Eastern. Specifically, markers found in Jewish and Levantine populations. Israeli authorities investigated, sent rabbis to study their practices. In 2005, the chief rabbinate recognized them as descendants of Israel. Thousands have since emigrated to Israel. More are preparing to follow. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia maintained Judaism in isolation for over 2,000 years. No contact with other Jewish communities, no rabbis, no Talmud, just Torah and tradition. They practiced animal sacrifice long after other Jewish communities abandoned it. They observed purity laws. They kept Sabbath. When Western scholars discovered them in the 19th century, Skepticism was immediate. These were African converts to Judaism, critics said, not actual Israelites. Genetic studies proved otherwise. Beta Israel carry Middle Eastern genetic markers. Their mitochondrial DNA shows ancient connections to Levantine populations. They're not converts, they're descendants. Over 130,000 Beta Israel have moved to Israel since the 1980s. Operation Solomon and Moses airlifted thousands during Ethiopian civil conflicts. The exodus from Ethiopia to Israel, a reversal of the ancient pattern when Israelites fled to Egypt during famine. The pattern repeats across regions Isaiah mentioned 2,700 years ago. Pashtun tribes in Afghanistan and Pakistan number over 40 million. Not all claim Israelite descent, but significant populations maintain traditions that separate them from surrounding Muslim cultures despite centuries of Islamic dominance. They light candles on Friday evening. They wear 4 tasseled garments. They circumcise on the 8th day, unusual in Islamic practice, which typically circumcises later. Their tribal names, Asher, Gad, Naphtali, match lost tribe names. Some Pashtun groups preserve creation stories and flood narratives that align more closely with Genesis than Quran. They have dietary restrictions that resemble kashrut more than halal. Genetic research shows elevated levels of Y chromosome haplogroups common in Middle Eastern Jewish populations. Not conclusive alone, but combined with cultural evidence, the pattern becomes compelling. Kurdish Jewish communities maintained distinct identity under Persian, Arab, and Turkish rule. They spoke Aramaic, the language of ancient Israel after Babylonian exile. They preserved traditions linking them to Assyrian deportations. Their genealogies tracked back to specific tribes. Most Kurdish Jews emigrated to Israel in the 1950s, over 150,000. They settled primarily in Jerusalem and northern Israeli towns. They brought traditions, languages, and genetic heritage directly traceable to ancient Israelite populations. In India's Manipur and Mizoram states, communities calling themselves B'nai Menashe aren't the only groups claiming Israelite descent. The Bene Ephraim in Andhra Pradesh, numbering over 5,000, claim descent from the tribe of Ephraim. They abandoned Hinduism in the 1980s after community leaders reported prophetic dreams revealing their true identity. Skeptics called it mass delusion, religious conversion disguised as ethnic discovery. But their traditional practices predated the revelation. Circumcision, avoidance of pork, Saturday Sabbath observance. These weren't new adoptions. They were inherited customs the community practiced without understanding their origin. DNA studies are ongoing. Preliminary results show genetic markers consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry distinct from surrounding Indian populations. The pattern is global. Communities separated by thousands of miles, different languages, different cultures, different histories, but common threads, genetic markers, cultural practices, oral traditions, connecting them to ancient Israel. In China, the Kaifeng Jews maintained community identity for over 1,000 years. They built a synagogue in 1163, preserved Torah scrolls, kept dietary laws. By the 20th century, assimilation had eroded most practices, but descendants still identified ethnically as Jewish. Genetic testing confirmed Middle Eastern ancestry. Chinese government now recognizes them as distinct ethnic minority. Some have emigrated to Israel, or more are seeking reconnection to Jewish identity their ancestors maintained against overwhelming pressure to assimilate. In Japan, the Makuya Christian movement believes Japanese people descend partially from lost tribes. They cite cultural similarities, ritual purity practices, festival traditions, even linguistic connections between Hebrew and ancient Japanese. Mainstream scholarship dismisses it. But Makuya members make pilgrimages to Israel. They study Hebrew. They support Israel politically and financially. They're seeking connection to an identity they believe was hidden but not destroyed. These aren't isolated curiosities, they're a global pattern. Populations in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe discovering or reclaiming Israelite heritage. Modern technology makes it possible: DNA testing, genealogical databases, cultural anthropology, historical linguistics. Tools that didn't exist a generation ago now reveal connections that were invisible before. And the discoveries are accelerating. More communities coming forward, more genetic studies confirming Middle Eastern ancestry in unexpected populations, more cultural practices being recognized as preserved Israelite traditions. The lost tribes aren't in one location. They're scattered exactly as Isaiah described, from Assyria, from Cush, from Elam, from the four corners of the earth. But scattered doesn't mean lost. It means distributed, preserved in fragments across continents, waiting for the time when identification becomes possible, when gathering becomes necessary. That time is now. The remnant is being identified by science, recognized by authorities, and remembering their heritage. Not in millions yet, in thousands, tens of thousands, but growing. Each discovery raises the same question. If these populations descended from Israel, what triggers their return? What makes scattered communities decide to leave homes they've occupied for centuries? The answer isn't comfortable. People don't abandon everything unless staying becomes impossible. Economic collapse, political persecution, social upheaval, war. Catalysts that will move thousands into millions are the same catalysts that moved Israel out of Egypt. Unbearable pressure, impossible circumstances, supernatural intervention that opens a pathway when no natural pathway exists. The remnant is being identified now. The gathering will happen later, soon, when the pressure becomes unbearable and the pathway opens. And when it opens, they'll know where to go. Because the highway is already marked by prophecy, by geography, and by bronze wheels that have been waiting on the seafloor for 3,500 years. The Chariot discovery in early 2026 wasn't the only significant event that year. It was part of a cluster, a convergence of economic, political, and social forces that seemed unrelated until you mapped them. Then, the pattern becomes visible. In March 2026, the global banking system experienced what analysts called a coordinated instability event. Not a crash, not a single point of failure. Simultaneous stress across multiple currencies and regions where remnant populations live. The Turkish lira collapsed to historic lows. Iranian rial became nearly worthless. Ethiopian birr lost 60% of its value in 3 weeks. Afghan economy, already fragile, entered free fall. Pakistan faced sovereign debt default. Each crisis had different technical causes, but the effect was identical. Populations in these regions lost savings, jobs, and economic security overnight. The middle class evaporated. Survival became the only calculation. When people can't eat, they move. History proves it. Economics drives migration more effectively than politics or ideology. Hunger is the ultimate motivator. The currency collapses hit hardest in regions Isaiah listed: Assyria, modern Iraq, Iran, parts of Turkey, Cush, Ethiopia, and Sudan, Elam, southwestern Iran. The exact locations where lost tribe populations have been identified. Coincidence doesn't stretch that far. In May 2026, political persecution escalated across Central Asia and the Middle East. New laws in Afghanistan restricted religious minorities. Pakistan implemented registration requirements for non-Muslim populations. Iran increased enforcement against Zionist sympathizers, code for anyone with suspected Jewish connections. Communities that had survived for generations suddenly faced impossible choices. Register and accept second-class status. Convert and abandon identity. Or leave. Thousands chose to leave. Applications for Israeli citizenship from these regions increased 400% between May and September 2026. The Israeli Interior Ministry struggled to process the volume. But the migration wasn't only to Israel. Populations were moving in multiple directions, toward stability, toward safety, toward regions where economic collapse hadn't hit yet. The movement was chaotic, unorganized, families making individual decisions based on immediate survival needs. But the aggregate direction was consistent. Southwest, toward the Mediterranean, toward established Jewish communities, toward Israel. In June 2026, something stranger happened. Reports began surfacing from communities in India, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. Reports of dreams, vivid, recurring dreams experienced by multiple people simultaneously. The dreams had consistent themes: a call to return, a homeland waiting, a journey that must begin soon. Western media dismissed it as mass hysteria, religious fervor amplified by economic stress. But the people experiencing the dreams took them seriously. Community leaders convened meetings, discussed the shared experiences, began planning for migration they hadn't considered before. This wasn't rational calculation, this was spiritual compulsion. And our people who had never visited Israel suddenly felt urgent need to go there. Families with stable situations started selling property and preparing to leave. Skeptics called it groupthink, social contagion, the power of suggestion in stressed populations. Believers called it something else. The signal Isaiah mentioned, the raised standard that would gather the outcasts. Not a physical flag, a spiritual summons that transcends logic. In August 2026, geopolitical alignments shifted. The Abraham Accords expanded to include 3 additional nations. Travel restrictions between Israel and Gulf states eased further. New airline routes opened. Border crossing agreements were signed. The infrastructure for mass migration was assembling without anyone explicitly planning for it. Governments thought they were facilitating tourism and commerce. They were actually preparing corridors for prophetic fulfillment. By September 2026, the pattern was undeniable. Economic pressure in source regions, political persecution increasing, spiritual compulsion spreading, infrastructure barriers lowering, all simultaneously, all affecting the same populations in the same regions. Migration numbers surged, not millions yet, tens of thousands. But the acceleration was exponential. 3 times as many people moved in September as in January. October numbers tripled September's total. Then came the scan results from Nuweiba. When news broke in November that bronze chariots had been confirmed on the Red Sea floor, something psychological shifted in the scattered communities. The discovery wasn't just archaeological validation, it was prophetic confirmation. If the first Exodus was real, proven by physical evidence, then the second Exodus was real too. If God parted the sea once, He could do it again. If the pathway existed then, it could open again. The discovery energized preparation. What had been theoretical became practical. Communities that were discussing migration started executing it. The trickle became a stream. Israeli immigration authorities were overwhelmed. Temporary processing centers opened in Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey to handle the volume. Airlines added flights. Ships were chartered. The movement of people accelerated beyond official capacity to manage it. By December 2026, the convergence was complete. Economic collapse created the push. Political persecution added urgency. Spiritual calling provided direction. Infrastructure enabled movement. And archaeological discovery confirmed the destination. Everything needed for mass migration assembled in a single year. Each component had different immediate causes, but the cumulative effect was identical, making it possible and necessary for scattered remnant populations to return. The 2026 convergence wasn't prophecy, it was current events. But current events that aligned with 2700-year-old predictions with such precision that separating natural from supernatural became impossible. Isaiah said the remnant would be gathered from specific regions. Those regions experienced simultaneous economic collapse. Isaiah said the Lord would raise a signal. Communities across continents reported supernatural calling. Isaiah said there would be a highway. Infrastructure development and political agreements opened pathways. Isaiah said it would be like the Exodus from Egypt. And in 2026, physical proof of that Exodus surfaced from the seafloor. The gathering isn't future. It's present tense, happening now in numbers that grow monthly. The 2026 convergence was the inflection point, the moment when scattered became gathering. when theoretical became actual. What happens next depends on how fast the pressure increases. Economic collapse could deepen. Political persecution could intensify. The spiritual calling could spread to larger populations, or the movement could slow, stabilize, become managed migration rather than desperate exodus. But history suggests pressure doesn't decrease. It builds until it breaks. The first exodus didn't happen because Pharaoh decided to be generous. It happened because Egypt was devastated, and holding Israel became impossible. The second exodus won't happen because nations decide to facilitate it. It will happen because staying becomes unbearable and leaving becomes the only option. The 2026 convergence created conditions for movement. The next phase will create conditions that make movement mandatory, not optional, not comfortable, desperate. And when desperate movement begins, millions don't fly commercial airlines. They don't process paperwork and wait for visa approval. They walk. They move in mass along any available route. The same route their ancestors used, the highway through the sea, the pathway marked by chariot wheels. The convergence proved the gathering has begun. What comes next will prove how fast it accelerates and how soon the pathway needs to open again. So the numbers tell the story statistics can't hide. Between 2020 and 2025, approximately 15,000 people from lost tribe communities immigrated to Israel. Steady trickle, documented, manageable. In 2026 alone, that number exceeded 47,000, more than triple the previous 5 years combined. And 2027 projections estimate over 120,000. The acceleration is exponential. Mathematical models show the curve turning vertical. What took decades is now happening in months. Israeli absorption centers designed for gradual integration are operating at 300% capacity. Temporary housing appears in open fields. Communities that didn't exist 6 months ago now house thousands. The Beta Israel immigration of the 1980s and 90s provided precedent. Operations Moses and Solomon airlifted tens of thousands from Ethiopia during crisis. The infrastructure existed. The legal framework was established. Returning Jews, even those whose Judaism was questioned by some, could claim citizenship under the law of return. But the current wave is different. These aren't established Jewish communities with clear documentation. These are populations claiming tribal descent based on genetics, culture, and oral tradition. The rabbinical establishment debates their status while the movement continues regardless. Genetic testing centers in Israel process thousands of samples monthly. DNA evidence that would have been theoretical 5 years ago now determines immigration eligibility. If you carry the markers, you qualify. Science has become the arbiter of ancient identity, and the markers keep appearing in populations nobody suspected. Kurdish families, Pashtun tribes, Indian communities, African villages, each test revealing Middle Eastern ancestry, each result adding to the gathering momentum. But it's not just immigration numbers, it's cultural revival. Communities that abandoned Jewish practice generations ago are reclaiming it. Synagogues are opening in regions that haven't had them in centuries. Torah schools appear in villages where Hebrew hasn't been spoken in millennia. The B'nai Menashe in India are teaching their children Hebrew, not as academic exercise, as native language, preparing them for a homeland most have never seen but all expect to inhabit. The Lemba in southern Africa are reconnecting with global Jewish communities, hosting rabbis, learning prayers their ancestors forgot, rebuilding identity that colonialism tried to erase. This isn't conversion, this is remembering. Identity returning after centuries of suppression. In Afghanistan, despite Taliban control and persecution risk, communities quietly maintain practices that mark them as different. Circumcision on the 8th day, Sabbath observance, dietary restrictions. They're not hiding anymore. They're preparing. The spiritual phenomenon from 2026 hasn't stopped. Reports continue. Dreams of return, visions of gathering, supernatural experiences that drive rational people to make irrational decisions, like leaving everything to walk toward a country they've never seen. Skeptics demand natural explanations. mass psychosis, social media amplification, economic desperation creating religious fantasy. But the dreams are too consistent, too detailed, too specific. People who've never read Isaiah describe highways through water. People who've never studied Exodus describe walls of sea and dry pathways. The content matches prophecy they don't know exists. Either it's the most elaborate coordinated hoax in history, or something beyond natural explanation is happening. The correlation between the Chariot discovery and the gathering acceleration can't be ignored. The scans were published in November 2026. Immigration applications spiked in December. By January 2027, the numbers had doubled again. Physical proof of the first Exodus triggered movement toward the second. Evidence removed doubt. Doubt removal released action. People who wondered if they were really descendants of Israel now had confirmation. The pathway their ancestors used was real. The God who opened it was real. The promise to gather them was real. Faith became certainty. Certainty became action. Action became migration. But the most telling sign isn't numbers, it's direction. Populations aren't just moving to Israel through modern airports, they're traveling overland, following ancient routes, moving through Jordan, through Sinai, through routes that make no economic sense, but perfect prophetic sense. Some groups specifically request to enter through the southern border, through crossings near the Red Sea. They want to complete the journey the way it began. They want to reverse the Exodus path. Travel agencies in Egypt report unusual requests. Tour groups asking about Nuweiba Beach, not as diving destination, as pilgrimage site, as starting point for journeys north. The geography is remembering. The people are remembering. And the convergence of both is creating movement that governments can observe but not control. Israeli officials watch the numbers climb. They prepare for possibilities they wouldn't have considered a decade ago. What if the trickle becomes flood? What if millions decide to return simultaneously? What if economic collapse or regional war forces mass exodus from multiple countries at once? The infrastructure can't handle it. No infrastructure could. When populations move in desperation, logistics break down. Organization becomes chaos, orderly immigration becomes refugee crisis. But refugee crises have happened before. This one would be different in one respect. These refugees wouldn't be fleeing to random destinations, they'd be going home, to a land that has legal obligation to accept them, to a tiny country already struggling with resource constraints and demographic pressures. And the gathering solves one prophetic requirement while creating impossible practical challenges. How do you absorb millions of people into a nation the size of New Jersey? Where do they live? How do they eat? What happens to the existing population? The questions don't have comfortable answers, but prophecy doesn't promise comfort. It promises fulfillment. And fulfillment is happening now in numbers that grow faster than solutions can develop. The Great Gathering isn't coming. It's here, in early stages, but undeniably present. The lost are being found, the scattered are returning, the tribes are remembering. And every week, the momentum builds. Every month, the numbers increase. Every year that passes accelerates the prophetic timeline toward its next checkpoint. The gathering marks the countdown. What it's counting down to is what comes after the gathering is complete. The gathering isn't the end. It's the warning before the end. Biblical chronology is precise. Events don't happen randomly. They follow sequence. The sequence matters because it reveals position on the timeline. Daniel's prophecy outlined the pattern. 70 weeks determined for Israel. 69 weeks completed at Messiah's first coming. 1 week remaining. That final week, 7 years, is the Great Tribulation. But the tribulation doesn't begin until specific preconditions are met. One of those preconditions is the gathering of Israel. Ezekiel saw it. Dry bones coming together, flesh covering them, breath entering them, a vast army standing. The vision wasn't metaphorical, it was chronological. Dead nation resurrected, scattered people regathered. Then comes the conflict. The modern state of Israel fulfilled part of that prophecy in 1948. A nation reborn after 2,000 years. But 1948 gathered only a fraction. Primarily European Jews. The lost tribes remained scattered. The current gathering is different. It's completing what 1948 started, bringing back the populations that weren't part of the first wave, the remnant from Assyria, from Cush, from the Four Corners. When the gathering is complete, the prophetic clock moves to the next hour, and the next hour is the darkest one. Jesus outlined the sequence in Matthew 24. The gospel preached to all nations. Then the end comes, Israel regathered. Then the tribulation begins. The signs pointing to his return would be visible when this generation sees them all. We're seeing them all. Israel exists. Jerusalem is Israeli capital. The Temple Mount is accessible, and now the lost tribes are returning. The pieces are in position. The board is set. Revelation describes what comes next. 7 years of escalating judgment, seal judgments, trumpet judgments, bowl judgments, global collapse, supernatural intervention, death on a scale that makes world wars look minor. 1/4 of humanity dead in the first half, 1/3 dead in the second. 2 billion people minimum, possibly more if population continues growing before the tribulation begins. The gathering serves two purposes. It completes the restoration, and it positions Israel for the conflict that comes next. Because the tribulation isn't global chaos with Israel as bystander, Israel is the focal point, the target, the reason the nations gather for war. Zechariah saw it. All nations coming against Jerusalem. The city surrounded, half the population exiled, then divine intervention, Messiah returning to fight, enemies destroyed, salvation for the remnant that remains. But that scenario requires Israel to be populated. The lost tribes must be home. The nation must be complete. Otherwise, the prophecy can't unfold as written. The current gathering is assembling the participants for the final act. Every person returning to Israel is taking their place in the prophetic script. They don't know it. Most wouldn't believe it. But their movement is fulfilling words written 2,500 years ago. The timeline is compressing. Events that took decades are happening in years. Years are becoming months. Acceleration is the signature of the end times. Birth pangs increasing in frequency and intensity. The chariot wheels surfaced in 2026. Alma, the gathering accelerated immediately after. The connection isn't coincidence, it's confirmation. Physical evidence of the first Exodus validated prophecy of the second. And when the second Exodus completes, the third phase begins. That third phase is judgment. Not on Israel alone, on the whole world. But Israel stands at the center because Israel is the covenant people, the nation through whom Messiah came, the nation through whom he returns. The gathering puts them in position. The tribulation tests them. The return of Christ saves them. We're watching the gathering now, which means the tribulation is next. Not centuries away, not generations. The next prophetic event on the calendar? How long until the gathering is complete? Unknown. But the acceleration suggests not long. If current trends continue, most of the identified remnant populations could be in Israel within a decade. Possibly sooner if economic or political catalysts intensify. Once they're home, the clock strikes midnight. The final week begins. 7 years of tribulation that ends with Christ's return and the establishment of his kingdom. The wheels mark where we've been. The gathering marks where we are. The tribulation marks where we're going. And the speed is increasing. The land bridge hasn't moved. It's been waiting for 3,500 years. The same ridge of rock, the same corridor between depths, ready. Modern infrastructure is building around it without recognizing what it's preparing. The proposed Saudi-Egyptian bridge would span the exact crossing corridor. Engineers selected the location for practical reasons. Shortest distance. Most stable geology. A best economic return. They chose the prophetic pathway without consulting prophecy. Regional agreements are removing barriers. Travel between nations that were enemies is becoming routine. The political infrastructure for mass movement is assembling. Nobody in government is planning for exodus. But Exodus doesn't require government planning. It requires crisis. And crisis is building in every region where remnant populations live. When the pressure becomes unbearable, people move. They don't wait for permission. They don't file paperwork. They walk. And when millions walk, they follow terrain. Natural pathways, routes that thousands can traverse simultaneously. The Red Sea crossing is that route. 8 miles wide, marked by ancient wheels, waiting to open again. The pathway doesn't need construction. It needs revelation. Water pushed back, ground exposed. The same miracle repeated for a new generation. The infrastructure proves it's possible. The gathering proves it's necessary. The prophecy proves it's coming. The reactivated pathway isn't metaphor. It's the next literal event on the prophetic calendar. And the calendar is running out of pages. The 2026 scans revealed one detail the research team buried in the technical appendix, something they photographed but didn't emphasize. At the deepest point of the land bridge corridor, the sub-bottom profiler detected a massive anomaly. Not wheels, not chariot debris. Something larger. Metallic signature. Geometric shape. Deliberate construction. The estimated size at roughly 40 feet long, 15 feet wide. Buried under sediment that carbon dating suggested was deposited after the wheel layer. Whatever sank there came after the chariots. Or with them. The team ran out of funding before deep excavation could begin. The anomaly remains documented but unexplored. Coordinates recorded, depth measured, composition partially analyzed. But here's what they didn't include in any public report. 3 months after the scan, satellite imagery showed activity at those exact coordinates. Underwater equipment, research vessel, no identification, no permits filed with Egyptian authorities. Someone else knows what's down there, and they're